All right. This is the Fresh Start Project, where we explore the growing loss of trust in our social institutions and how we can break free from broken systems and move towards something better. My name is Christian Mislowick, and with me today is Alex Feinberg. Alex, you have an extremely unique background and an interesting skills stack. So, former pro athlete, you're in the finance world, worked at Google, and now you're self-employed as a fitness coach.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It all makes sense if I can explain it. So, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my parents, we were upper middle class, but we're not clearly upper middle class. My parents drove Japanese cars and were very frugal in how they spent money.
Mhm.
And I didn't realize, as a 15, 16-year-old kid, that there was ways to become successful and become financially independent outside of being an entertainer, because that's kind of how you think you get rich when you're 15, 16 years old and your dad isn't an investment banker, hedge fund manager, or real estate tycoon. And so, wanting to make something of my life, make something of myself, I decided at the age of 15 that I was going to get very good at baseball. And, I didn't really have a ton of talent, if you ask the coaches who coached me, but I worked really hard.
Mhm.
And part of the reason I worked really hard is because I overestimated the benefits that would come from being an elite athlete and the opportunities and doors that it would open. Um, that being said, I did have the chance to accept a scholarship to go play baseball at Vanderbilt University before they were the national powerhouse that they are today. They would never recruit a prospect like me now, but they did back then, and they gave me a good scholarship, and I had the opportunity to play with a lot of very, very prominent athletes, many of whom went on to become Major League Baseball players. One thing that became apparent to me when I was at Vanderbilt is how baseball players think differently from most people. And my first year or two, I kind of thought, well, they're just not that smart. But because I always pay attention to why other people might be outperforming me, or
Mhm.
why certain personality traits might be beneficial in certain contexts and detrimental in others, I came to realize that the intelligence that baseball rewarded was simply different than the intelligence that academia rewarded. And if I wanted to be successful in baseball, I needed to understand how to think like most people and most baseball players, meaning shifting away from reliance on logic or over reliance on logic, using heuristic shortcuts to connect dots around me. Whether that is a smart decision or bad decision, if you don't know how to do it, you don't know how most people think.
Mm.
And getting deeper into these heuristic shortcuts, I noticed a lot, learned a lot about human psychology, and was able to convince a hedge fund manager after I got done playing minor league baseball that it was sensible to bring me onto his fund, just based on how I observed human behavior, people watching for years. And I went to go work for him. He was a very, very different type hedge fund manager than most. He was a conspiracy theorist. He took me around on private jets when I was 23 years old,
Yeah.
and would look at me with a blank face and say the entire world's fascist. And one of the things that he did really well in 2009, he didn't really lose that much money. His fund was down 9%, 7%, something like that, when everybody else was down 30%.
Yeah.
Because he saw the derivative exposure that the financial services industry had was just excessive, and then there was a lot of issues that could come that most other people didn't see. And I remember very clearly, like it was yesterday, driving around with him in LA in 2010, and he's looking at me, pupils like the size of pinheads, just saying very coldly, very directly, "We're looking at empty streets." And he says to me, "You're going to see tent cities everywhere." And I
Mm.
was like, this guy's kind of crazy, but I know he's very wealthy. I know
What
he's
year was this?
2010.
Yeah.
Go to LA now, he's right.
Pretty
Um,
prescient.
yeah, and the reason he was right is because he understood the monetary system, and he understood that the Federal Reserve was going to juice markets forever to bail out Wall Street in 2008, and a
Mhm.
byproduct of that was going to be inflation and massive wealth inequality that would result in tent cities popping up everywhere. So, working for him 2010 to 2011, learning the financial system, learning the history of the Federal Reserve, learning structure and orientation of the Federal Reserve, I decided he was right, and that the central banks in the West would keep interest rates low for a long period of time. And I realized that that was going to make the tech sector take off. because the tech sector is one of the most speculative, if not the most speculative sector in the economy. And with speculative sectors, they have high sensitivity to cost of capital. If they can't raise money, they die because they wouldn't be cash flow positive, or they're certainly not profitable. And so a small change in interest rates might make a small difference for some companies, but it makes a huge difference for tech companies, even if they're not taking on debt. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the biggest reasons why we've seen NASDAQ explode over the last 10, 20 years. 2011, I didn't really know that much about tech. I just saw from a top-down standpoint that the sector was going to do really well. Used some of the heuristic shortcuts that I learned as a baseball player, elevator pitched my way into Google, made no progress, trying online applications for about 8 weeks, finagled my way in for a breakfast meeting one morning, wore a suit, brought a notepad, and was introduced to a couple hiring managers. And over the course of about 30 seconds, I made more progress convincing them that they should hire me than the summation of the 8 weeks prior. And so I ended up getting a job offer from Google, worked in sales for a couple of years, moved to corporate strategy and then product partnerships. Before the crypto market took off in 2017, I realized that, a lot of the things that I was studying in finance aligned very well with crypto. And I think crypto could be a big thing. I wrote an article in 2018, early 2018, talking about how the decline in institutional trust is exactly correlated with the rise in crypto. Mm-hmm. I ended up joining a crypto exchange based in San Francisco. And when I joined the crypto industry, I realized that a lot of other sales BD people, I was in a sales role, had prominent Twitter followings. And about 6 months prior to that, I had thought to myself, if there's one way that I can impact the world, it is to share what I've learned in fitness. Forgot to cover that. I noticed when I was in college that good-looking people had advantages in everything that they did. And not knowing how I was going to navigate my career, I thought, the one thing I can do to hedge my bets is always work out, always look good in a suit, and always speak well. And so I kept training very rigorously in my 20s, never, ate a diet that was aligned with fat loss, but figured out over a course of several years how to get shredded without counting calories and not going hungry and only eating delicious food. And so at the time I joined the crypto industry, part of my mind is thinking crypto is the industry that's going to make me wealthy. And part of my mind is thinking, if I want to do well in the crypto industry, I need to grow my Twitter following. And then another part of my mind is saying, if there's actually any way I can impact the world the most that I want to, that's going to actually be through fitness. And so through 2018, 2019, I started creating a Twitter account based around fitness, based around my 4,000 calorie diet and, six-pack abs. And that did really well, a lot better, a lot faster than I expected. And after about a couple of years of that, the income had grown to near what I was making in crypto. And I decided, I don't really want to have a boss. I can go do this full time now.
What was the connection in your mind between success in crypto and a large Twitter following?
If you look at some of Pomp, for example, Anthony Pompliano, we used to hang out in San Francisco before he had 1,000 Twitter followers or something like that. I didn't even know he had a Twitter account because I never used Twitter when we would hang out. Mm-hmm. But he's basically built his career on Twitter. Were it not for Twitter, you wouldn't know who that guy is. But he's gone, he went from 5,000 followers to 60,000 followers or so in 2017. And from 2017 to 2021, he has 1.5 million now. So because he's a growth marketer, right? He knows how to grow. And so from seeing his account, seeing a couple other prominent crypto folks with 100,000, 150,000, 200,000 followers, I thought, if I'm in a sales role and I lack the institutional expertise that other people in sales roles have, how am I going to be valuable to a company 3 years down the line if everybody else in this industry's got at least 10,000 Twitter followers and I don't? So I decided I needed to grow my account simply to preserve my ability to make an income as a sales rep. I never thought that I'd be able to make an income selling my fitness products. It just so happens I have been able to.
That's interesting. So I've been in DC for probably over 8 years now. And at one point I was noticing that everybody who wanted to be an influencer had their own book. They would hire a ghostwriter, things like that. It was almost like this is the new business card. But it's interesting. Like, I think having a huge following is kind of the new resume for at least people who are, like you said, in sales, or have to demonstrate that they can make that human connection through any medium, including the internet, including Twitter.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it makes it a lot easier to get your voice out. And Trump was probably one of the first most prominent examples of that. He bypassed the mainstream media and just went one-to-one through Twitter and got himself elected in 2016 with it.
Yeah. It was brilliant. And that's why it was the one thing they had to take away from him before the next term. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, so if you're not developing, and Twitter is even subject to, you know, censorship itself. So, you know, the next iteration of that Substack or getting people coming to your website. But if you're not reliant on a third party institution for exposure, you don't have to put up with their BS.
Yeah.
Right. So the reason why Trump could be so disrespectful to people in the media is because he didn't need them. I mean, he did need them because they essentially got him, you know, got Biden elected in 2020, but he didn't need them to get elected in 2016. He was openly rude and it didn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Gave him that freedom.
Yeah.
Well, that was an awesome intro, and it demonstrates why you're the person to talk to for this topic that's on my mind right now. It's been on my mind a lot, and it's really about how people can not rely on somebody else, a third party, for their livelihoods. I want to talk to you about like how the modern world, well, especially the modern world, but for most of human history, most people had to rely on other people and were financially dependent on other people. So I would like to talk to you about how folks can kind of gain more sovereignty and autonomy over how they make a living, how they can get more control over their livelihoods. And I guess like a good way to kind of kick off the conversation is, well, you hear the saying a lot, you'll never get rich working for somebody else. So my question for you is that true, and why or why not?
I mean, there's definitely some people at Google who've made hundreds of millions of dollars working for somebody else, but the reason it's not true is because of the leverage that exists in negotiations between employers and employees. So taking a step back, you know, I was an economics major at Vanderbilt, not because I was interested in economics, but because my dad was an economics major, and it just allowed me to defer deciding what I wanted to do when I was a grown up. So economics. But one thing that we talked about in economics is a concept called a monopsony. Now, most people know what a monopoly is. Most people kind of understand that Comcast is basically a monopoly. You don't like dealing with them. If you ask people, who do you hate dealing with as a customer the most? They're going to list airlines. They're going to list Comcast, telecom companies. They're going to list companies that exist in industries with minimal competition. The reason they hate dealing with them is because you don't really have that many choices. And if you don't have that many choices, kind of take it or leave it. What people don't realize is most employment relationships are the inverse of that. What's called a monopsony. A monopsony is when there is one buyer for many sellers, whereas a monopoly is there's one seller for many buyers. But the leverage dynamic is the same. If there's one buyer, the employer, and there's many sellers, the employees who are selling their labor, the employees can't really get much leverage over that employer. And so what ends up happening is, especially large employers, they start to commoditize their workforce. So they want to, you know, they'll tell you, oh, you know, we care about everybody. We will reward you for hard work. At the same time, they're constructing their organization like Legoland. They want as many interchangeable parts as possible, and they will reward you and steer you towards making yourself interchangeable, right? The more willing you are to sacrifice your ability to negotiate with them, the more likely you are to be put in a position to continue to get promoted and you know, and quote unquote succeed and climb up the corporate ladder. But what ends up happening is, if you're frustrated with how your employer throws mandates on you, too bad. You can go find another one, but you don't have the opportunity that, say, an influencer does, where, you know, I'm still dependent on others, right? So that doesn't change, because if I don't have customers, I can't sell anything. But there's one of me and there's thousands of them. So if I don't like the way one customer is treating me, I can just say, screw off. I don't need, like, am I going to lose 0.1% of my revenue? Okay, bye. Whereas if I had revenue concentration, if one customer amounted to 60% of my revenue or 100% of my revenue, in the case of a full-time employee, it's much harder to tell people to get lost.
Yeah.
And that is what a lot of people don't even realize about their work relationship, because they've never known it any other way, right? But once you realize that basic economic frameworks are structured to disadvantage you, and you can see market dynamics, which 98% of people cannot, you realize that most decisions that people make and they think are like completely normal are actually terrible. And some decisions that don't make sense to a lot of people are actually pretty sensible.
So employers are generally trying to squeeze as much value as they can out of individuals, and perhaps the process of negotiating promotions or salary raises, that's all designed to keep the employees satisfied with incremental increases, but it's not really paying them for what they're worth. Is that generally true?
Yeah, you get paid as an employee, as a non-senior executive employee, you get paid for your replacement cost. So if you do a really good job, what they will tend to do is they'll stack rank their employees. And for simplicity's sake, let's just say they have 100 employees, all of whom are junior. You keep the senior executives in a separate bucket for now. If the junior employee does really well, what they do is they say, okay, we're going to bonus you at the top of the band. So there's 10 people in your cohort. You're going to get the highest bonus of all those 10. That bonus is going to be 30% of what your base salary is. Your base salary is determined by your replacement cost. So they'll take labor surveys around your geographic location. They say, okay, software engineer with 2 to 4 years of experience. The 50th percentile wage is 120,000. The 80th percentile wage is 180,000. The 97th percentile wage is 230,000. And so the company just decides, okay, which percentile do we want to compensate our employees in? And they're going to factor in churn and all these other things, cost of training, lawsuits probably, to determine what they want to pay. And then if you end up doing well, you only get a portion of what that replacement wage is. So this might not make sense for a lot of people who haven't thought deeply about it, but the way that you hit home runs in life is you do something that ends up being 30 times better than the next alternative, right? So that's how you get rich, is you have an idea and it ends up working 30 times better than the alternative and you get paid out for it. But as an employee, you can't capture upside exponentially. So if you end up, say, creating Gmail, or you end up creating a new product for your company that makes them millions of dollars, you're not going to get a percentage of the millions that they give you. You're going to get a percentage of your replacement cost. So it's weighted by your cost of replacement rather than the revenue that you produce or add to the company. And because of that, you will almost certainly never become wealthy working for somebody else unless you happen to get some equity that ends up, turning into something valuable. But even most people in those situations get very, very negligible equity. And so, unless you're working for an Uber or a Google, you're getting paid in hopes and dreams.
Wow. That is a completely different way for me of understanding how work works, your replacement cost. Generally, people like to believe that they're being paid for what their value is worth in the local market.
Well, that's what you tell people when you want them to work hard and be loyal to you.
Yeah.
But it's not true.
It's not true. Wow. It also explains all right, so I was operating under this assumption that perhaps your labor is compensated at a market rate according to your value, to the value you produce for the company. And if it is perhaps slightly unfair that corporations would kind of squeeze as much value as they can out of you, if that is true, why do you see so much rent-seeking behavior? I mean, I've often been in positions where I can notice people are not really adding to the company. They're still drawing a paycheck, but maybe it's like the Pareto distribution. Like, you see a lot of people on any given staff not doing much, but then there's like maybe a smaller percentage that are creating a lot more value.
Well, it's because companies don't actually know who's doing what. and they won't compensate people in outsized fashion for being in the 10 or 20% who actually produce. So this is true in my experience at most companies. Most of the work is done by 5 to 20% of people.
Yeah.
But and I would say 50% or more of the value added is added by 5 to 20% of people. Now, if if you took too many economics classes in college, you might believe that those 5 to 20% of employees who are producing 8 times their population in terms of value, and you're adding 50%, but you're only 10%, maybe 5 times your value, you would think, okay, those guys are getting paid 5 times more than everybody else. No, they're
It's
not.
the replacement cost.
They're getting paid 20% more. So if you have a corporate job and you realize, like, if I bust my ass, make millions for the company, they're going to pay me 20% more, or I can just figure out how to get by and draw my paycheck without working too hard, what is the most rational choice to make? Right? And why do you think companies like hiring insecure people? Companies like hiring capable, insecure people, because those are kind of the only people who are going to work hard when they're not financially incentivized to. Right? So corporations will recruit very similarly to street gangs. Street gangs look for capable, insecure people to do their bidding, because they don't want to get in trouble. So they just rather get a capable, insecure kid to commit the felonies and they can keep the loot. Right? Well, it's the same thing. That's how corporations work, is they want that guy who got straight A's. They want that guy who needs to be the best. And then if they can define what best is, if the mind is young and impressionable and the employer can define what best is for that employee, then they own him. And the goal is just to replicate slavery, but in a 21st century model. And so all sorts of mind games are understood by the human resources department that typically reports to the CFO, and they use these to fulfill their duties of minimizing the cost associated with employment. That's what HR is built for.
Yeah, that's disturbing. I would say the majority of people work for a large organization. I actually don't know if that's true. I think, like, the
I don't
best.
think it's true.
It's not.
No. Most people work at like under 100-person companies, but the most prominent companies are obviously larger. So Forbes isn't going to like do an overview of Bob's pickup truck repair that has 30 employees or something like that. But on balance, more people work for a company like Bob's than work for like Microsoft.
But companies like Bob's with 30 employees are probably still employing the same mind tricks and the same kind of. It's not so much.
Sometimes, I mean, if the boss is a real dick, maybe, but it's harder to, and it's actually less practical too. So the corporate employment model works when you have hundreds or thousands of employees. You can't understand what your ground level employee is doing when there's 6 reporting levels between the CEO and the base level employee. You can't. Nobody's that smart. They want to convince you that they are, but nobody knows. And so what ends up happening when the companies get to be like 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 is, if there's like six lines of reporting between you and the CEO, your productivity is reduced to an Excel sheet, like an Excel cell. And what happens when your productivity or your evaluation of your productivity is based on one numerical input, everything gets gamed, because it's going to be a very imprecise measure of your output. And people are going to be smart enough to realize, like, okay, well, this is how they keep score. This is how I can get a high score. This is how I can add value, but I'm not going to get a high score adding value. And so, most employees, you can figure out if it's like a quadrant: get a high score, provide low value; get a high score, provide high value; get a low score, provide low value; get a low score, provide high value. Very few employees are going to like choose to get a low score and provide high value. Some employees are going to choose to get a high score and provide high value. And most employees are going to try to get a high score without providing high value, because that's the easiest. That's effectively, that pads their margins the best. If you consider output or effort, the cost of that would accrue to the employee. And so companies don't want to let you know that they can't figure out who's doing that. Like, eventually they can, but on a quarter-to-quarter basis, they don't know. But they're not going to tell the employees they don't know. They're going to tell you that, oh, we've carefully reviewed everything, this and that. They've carefully reviewed it to the extent that they can, but they don't know. And because they don't know, the expectations will become more and more outsized. because it's basically a number that's detached from reality. Oh, you can grow at 20% this year. You grew it last year. You can grow at 20% next year. You grew it this year. And then all of a sudden you're growing a fake number, and you figured out, well, the only way I can hit my expectations is by cutting corners. And I'm either going to get fired for failing to hit my expectations, or I'm going to get fired for cutting the corners. And one path is easier than the other, so I'm going to cut the corners. And then the company just ends up having a lot of fraudulent subdivisions within it because it hasn't figured out how to actually evaluate its employees. And that model doesn't work as optimally if there's 20 people. If there's 20 people, you can qualitatively evaluate who's doing what. And if it's small enough, a qualitative analysis tends to be superior than a quantitative analysis, but nobody can perform an organization-wide qualitative analysis for a 10,000 plus person organization. Just impossible.
Mm-hmm. Because that would involve a lot of like one-on-one conversations, and somebody who's really good at reading people. Is that how you would do it?
No, I mean, it's too much time. Like there's one CEO and 10,000 employees. How is he going to get a qualitative? He doesn't have time to meet with every ground level employee. He doesn't have time to meet with every manager of a ground level employee. Mm-hmm. He also doesn't have time to meet with every manager of a ground level employee. So it ends up being a game of telephone, communicating the value that you provided to your boss. They're communicating the value of what their team produced to their boss. They're communicating the value of what their organization did to their boss. And you end up losing the qualitative aspects of it with each reporting layer you go up. And so the only way you can get rid of that is by eliminating reporting layers, but then you lose other efficiencies. It's like, imagine armies without a general. Like, they're kind of not going to do that well. Mm-hmm. So scale brings problems. It brings benefits, but it brings a lot of problems that don't exist for smaller organizations. It is easier to get paid more money at a large company. Yeah. It's harder to get treated humanely in a large company. And that's the trade-off.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I just saw the other day on YouTube a video. You might have seen it. It was Carl Icahn, the financier. Mm-hmm. The name of the video was "Why Carl Icahn Fired 12 Floors of People." And mm-hmm. he was talking about the situation where he had just purchased I think it was a transportation company based in Manhattan. The company had a building there with 12 floors of people. He couldn't figure out what these guys were doing for the company. He knew there was a guy, I think in Chicago, who was kind of in charge of the actual transportation, the trains that the company made their money on. He talked to that guy after the guys in Manhattan were like, no, don't talk to him. We know what we're doing. Just assume that we're taking care of things. So he went to talk to the real train guy, and he said, oh, just fire those 12 floors. They're not contributing anything. And Carl Icahn was like, okay, I'll take that under advisement. He hired like a consultant to evaluate what the 12 floors were doing. The consultant said, okay, give me $250,000. We'll do a review, give you a report. He comes back with like a phone book, like just something that nobody would ever read. Carl Icahn is like, well, I'm not going to read this. Just tell me what you found. And the consultant was like, I like you, Mr. Icahn. I'm just going to be straight with you. We don't know what these guys do anyway. We also don't know what these guys do as well. And so he found out eventually, after kind of like sifting through like what was really going on, that they weren't producing any value. They were just kind of a parasitic part of bureaucracy. And it makes you wonder, like, well, what percentage of corporate America is not producing value, or producing very minimal value, or negative value? Like, what do you think?
60%, 70%.
That's disturbing.
But it's disturbing when you look at it with the utopian lens. It's probably actually about as good as it's ever been. I mean, before large corporations existed, you couldn't really get by on a farm not pulling your weight. Yeah. But as I think it's mostly clear that life is generally better now than it was 150 years ago. Not in every way, obviously, but technology makes things easier. Yeah. And so with technology becomes, with the industrialization of the economy comes scale, and with scale comes larger organizations, and with larger organizations come these games. And so again, this is a trade-off. The alternative is you don't operate at the same scale. And we've found that scale during the post-industrial revolution, scale is so beneficial that it could overcome the aspect of human nature that leads most people in large organizations to not do anything. right?
Wow.
So it's just, there isn't really a good alternative to that outside of what we're seeing right now, where a lot of young gunners are realizing, like, actually, I don't need a team of 1,000. I just need a team of like 6.
Right.
And we're just going to go make like $400 million and split it between all of us. And obviously, that's not the base case, but that happens more now, especially with crypto, than at any other time. If you wanted to make $10+ million 20 years ago, you had to be fairly decent at leading people. Now you don't. You can just work with like 5 people if you found the right niche to work on and you have a competitive advantage.
So going back to, like, let's say 50 or 60% of corporations are not producing value. I understand that the cost of having people who are not producing value is that's acceptable because scale makes things more efficient. But how is that? How is it like utopian to expect better? Like, you don't think that it's kind of tragic? Like, there's a lot of human potential that's lost if we just say, hey, that's good enough, that's acceptable.
Well, you have to think about what the alternatives are. The only way that you can get rid of that is more surveillance,
Uh-huh.
right? It's like companies don't like wasting money. They're not into wasting money. So if all large companies are wasting a very meaningful portion of their spending on people who aren't doing very much, there's a reason for it, right? Either they lack the technological ability to determine how they're misspending their money. That's basically it. They lack the ability to determine how and why they're misspending their money. So they continue to do it until they gain the technological expertise or managerial expertise to determine how they're misspending money. No company wants to do it. No CFO keeps his job because they're just bleeding money. But every company bleeds money to some extent.
Yeah. So if they're not surveying their employees, you mentioned like they can increase the quality of their managerial staff,
or the scrutiny of the managerial staff, but then that tends to increase churn, right? So you say, okay, there's a lot of people who aren't doing anything. We need to, every manager needs to have a much better pulse on what their employees are doing.
Yeah.
Well, that might help the underperformers perform better, but maybe the top performers don't like that. And they're like, dude, I can do my job. Just leave me alone.
Right.
Maybe you end up alienating. You see, this is kind of like Freakonomics, I think Ariely, if you wrote that, talked about this, where we invest in helping out or bringing up the bottom because we think, well, if we can just get the bottom to perform at an average level, think about how much better we're going to be. But that fails to account for the fact that in most groups, the progress is made by a small number of people, not including the people at the bottom. And so if progress is made by a small number of people and you say, okay, well, we got a lot of lazy people. We need to figure out how we can get their productivity up. You might end up killing your own golden goose by giving someone who doesn't need it, more performance reviews, right? More KPIs. And they say, you know what? I like this company before we did this. No, thanks. And then what? If you lose 30% of the 10% of the company that's doing something meaningful, but then the 90% that isn't doing anything, like maybe they produce 30% more, it's like you haven't gotten any better. That's not a win.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like, would you rather have like one Don Draper or like 50 of the other writers?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting. I want to talk about something else you said. It's easy to make a lot of money if you're working for somebody at a corporation, but there's also the risk of it being less humane, less being treated with respect.
I wouldn't say a lot of money. It's easier to make more money.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of people accept that. They would trade being treated with respect to make, decent money, right? And
they would, but everything's dynamic, right? And companies always change just like people do. And so you can have a company that says, you know what, we get some good employees if we just treat them well. Treat them well for a couple of years, and the employees are really happy. And then they're like, you know what, we can get another round of things are going really well. got this private equity group that's interested in investing in us. If they can take a board seat, I would like to get a little bit of a payout. I think we can really use this capital. So we're going to take it on. Well, what's that private equity firm going to do? They're going to come in and they're going to make it less humane.
Mm.
Right. So if the system works well enough, it'll attract outside capital, and then maybe it'll stop being as humane.
Hmm. Do you think people are putting up with that less and less? I mean, you read about the great, what is it? The Great Resignation. More people are dissatisfied with their workplace. Lockdowns, COVID-19 lifestyles made them realize, oh, I can work from home and I'm not dealing with the stress of having to deal face to face with people who are not treating me well. Is that a wake up call to how corporate America thinks, or is it not just a blip on the timeline?
Are you saying, is corporate America going to realign how they act in response to it?
Sure. Or are people are people going to be demanding more humane treatment no matter where they work? And is that going to be a trend going forward?
I think they will, but it's not, it's a multivariate trend. So I think people are going to be demanding more humane treatment, but companies are also going to want to be able to surveil their employees better when they're not working at the company. So like some companies, they can monitor your keystrokes, they can see all the websites you're going to. So there's going to be some form of productivity measurement, whether you're working remote or you're working in the office.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's a cat and mouse game, right? And so once employees find ways to conceal their lack of productivity, companies are going to invest in tools to surveil the productivity. And then the next set, the next iteration is the employees figure out a way to get around those tools. Then the tool providers adjust their products to cover for that. Yeah. It's just a back and forth. It's like, everybody's trying to scam everybody.
Yeah, it's funny. Meanwhile, a lot of work is probably not getting done, but that's okay.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah. So let's talk about how to escape from this. Like, let's say corporate life isn't for you. You tried it. You don't like it. How do you become like an Alex Feinberg? You're working for yourself, or you're working with a small team of people who you like and trust and you get along with.
Yeah. So to my earlier point about monopolies and monopsonies is I realized from working in corporate America that you do not want to put yourself in a commoditized position, because when you're in a commoditized position, you get compensated for your replacement cost rather than your unique productivity. And so I always wanted to be able to get compensated for something that I was doing, for the value that I was adding. And I realized that if the value I was adding wasn't somewhat unique, I was never going to get paid meaningfully for it. And so what I ended up doing for my escape, because I didn't have all the time in the world and I didn't have all the energy in the world, is I focused on something that I was passionate in. I was training my ass off for years before I was made a single dollar off of training, off of fitness. And so it was my passion. I spent a lot of my free time doing it. And from spending a lot of my free time doing it and also being a little bit innovative, I found a lot of shortcuts that the mainstream hadn't picked up on. And because my mind is generally interested in these things, like I think it's very fascinating, it didn't feel like work the way work felt like work. So when you're trying to plot your escape, you need to be cognizant of a couple things. Number one, how is your energy? Are you managing your energy well? Because you need to have a lot of energy to manage if you're going to get out of there. Just like, if you're driving away from home, you want to have a full gas tank. So when you pick things that you're naturally interested in, you get better gas mileage. Yeah. Right? You can work harder, you can work longer. It doesn't feel like work as much. And if you're naturally interested in it, you probably have unique insights that other people in your sector haven't picked up on. And so because I had unique insights, because I am interested in fitness and food and everything about it, it didn't really feel like it was that hard for me to do the work that was necessary to grow my audience, launch products, launch various services. I mean, it's not like, breathing. It's a little bit more complex than that, but it's a lot easier than going to law school, right? Passing a bar, something like that. But you have to think a little bit uniquely, because if you don't think uniquely, you don't really have a competitive advantage. There's too many other people who can do something just like you, that you're going to end up working twice as hard to make 70% of the money that you were making at your corporate job. So the more diverse your background is relative to other people in the space that you're interested in, the more likely you are to have unique ideas that others haven't thought of, the easier your escape will be.
Right. So let's say you want to distinguish yourself or just set yourself out from the pack, like you said. Is this advice that could be given to anyone with a reasonable expectation of it being executed, or is it really just a handful of the population could really do this?
I mean, you need to be able to think independently.
Yeah.
Right. If you can't think independently, you can't produce anything that other people can't produce. It's going to be really, really hard for you to stand out. How are you going to stand out if you think just like everybody else? If you think like everybody else, all your actions are going to align with what everybody else does. How are you going to have a competitive advantage? You have a competitive advantage when you find things that other people don't find to be important, and you find things that other people find to be important to be not important. That allows you to rebalance how you spend your time, energy, and focus. And if you happen to be right, then you can have better results with less effort than the next person. But if you're wrong, or if you're average, if you only understand the world the way it's been explained to you by a third party, you're never going to have a competitive advantage launching a differentiated and unique product, good, service.
Mm-hmm. Any advice on like how people can like self-assess themselves on that score? Like,
I think you know if you're a unique thinker or not.
Yeah.
If people think you're weird, that's not always a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right. I've found that if you can get paid for the thing that makes you weird, you're going to have very little competition, because that's what makes you weird. There's not that many other people.
That's great advice.
Yeah. That was something I noticed, like paying attention to Mark Zuckerberg, where it's like, oh, this guy's like, he's totally weird, because he could have sold his company for $200 million and he's like 21 years old and he didn't do it.
Yeah.
It's like he's figured out a way to make his work align with things that he finds really enjoyable and nobody else can. So monetize your weird is the first thing. And if you're not weird, it's going to be hard, because you're not.
Well, if you're not weird, you probably wouldn't even enjoy setting out on yourself. I mean, there's so many easier pathways to make it.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah.
And you won't feel as suffocated, being part of a pack. It's, the people who feel suffocated being part of a pack are people who believe themselves to be better than others and don't necessarily find safety in numbers. They find it more constraining than enabling. And sometimes they're right. They're wrong more times than not. More times it's somebody who just has a mismatched understanding of his own ability or her own ability. And I think that's a big reason why a lot of entrepreneurs fail. Although before I succeeded with what I'm doing now, I failed in all the entrepreneurial endeavors I tried. Not that it was like many, many years, but it's like, try this thing for 3 months, that didn't work out. Try this thing for 9 months, that didn't work out. So like, this iteration right here is like maybe my third or fourth entrepreneurial endeavor. The other ones, maybe 3 to 12 months of, like, you could say wasted effort, but you always learn from it. But I never gave up, because I always wanted to escape. And I always thought that I was more than a corporate puppet. And I never identified with the people who sought promotions. I thought they were weak. And I thought they were weak because the attributes that they had would not have been rewarded on the baseball field. And even though I haven't played baseball professionally for 12 years, a lot of my formative years were as a competitive athlete. And the way I assess strength and weakness and value in others is heavily influenced by my experience as a competitive athlete. So if I see somebody with traits that my college coach would have said are embarrassing, and this guy's getting promoted and everybody thinks he's great at work, I'm like, I don't want to be that guy.
Interesting.
Weak.
Yeah. What are some of those traits, or rather, what are some of the lessons from from baseball that you can bring to bear when assessing like a workplace?
So sports like baseball are very, let's say, very transparent. It's very obvious who's doing well. It's very obvious who's not doing well. It's very obvious who's making excuses. So your coach will not put up with your excuses, because it's obvious when you're making them, right? Also in sports, you can't freely transfer. There's not free labor movement. If I don't like my coach, I can't just go play in another college next week, which I can do in the workforce.
Yeah.
If I don't like my my professional team, I can't just sign a contract with another team the following week, which I can do in the labor force. So there's much more restricted movement, which allows for more authoritarian coaches. And there's also more transparency, which allows them to know when you're screwing up. And so the people who make excuses in sports get weeded out very quickly, because they're very easy to identify and there's almost no downside in identifying them. When you apply that to a corporate setting, number one, you can't be as strict with your employees because they can leave,
Yeah.
in a way that they can't on a sports field. And number two, because the companies are so large, like we talked about earlier, you don't actually know whose fault things are. And so you'll notice that as people rise to the top, they have two traits that don't exist in sports. Number one, their body language in the middle management position is actually more docile, right? Mm-hmm. Coaches like people with dominant body language because they think these people can succeed under pressure. They can handle the heat. They can handle the adversity. In a corporate setting, if you have dominant body language, you threaten people. They give you worse performance reviews, and then they get passive aggressive. They don't like you. So the people who end up succeeding in the corporate world don't announce their presence with authority. There are not any Joe Burrows in corporate America at junior levels because they all get fired or pushed out. Because nobody, like, number one, you can't outperform other people in a junior position the way you can in sports. It's just not, it's too murky, right? Because you can't outperform people, you can't have an outsized ego because there's an imbalance between your production and your ego. And if you did, you kind of stick out and nobody likes you. It requires approval. Sports don't require approval of anybody. Hit a home run, you hit a home run. You could be the biggest asshole in the world, you still hit a home run, you're gonna get paid for it. But because there's more of a qualitative aspect to work analysis, it's more opaque. You can't be a high-performing dick as easily as you can in sports.
Because nobody knows you're high-performing except perhaps you and your boss.
Exactly. And so the people who end up succeeding end up having more passive body language than dominant athletes, and they're actually better at making excuses. So they're better at taking credit for things that they didn't do, and they're better at shifting blame from things that they did do because they take advantage of the opacity. If you're not taking advantage of the opacity of corporate work, you're not winning. People who win are kind of not admirable.
Right. Interesting. It's funny, like every once in a while you'll come across something that's like a book or something that's so illuminating, it makes you see things differently. I once listened to on Audible, I think his name is Joe Navarro. He's a former FBI, CIA. He was in a law enforcement organization, and he was an expert on body language, and he was talking about body language in this book, like how to read it, how to present yourself as trustworthy, or like you said, more confident through dominant language. Like, what are some of the things that if you're in that middle management layer of the workforce, but you're doing like dominant body language, it'll get you in trouble? Like, what are some examples of that?
Of the body language or getting in trouble?
The type of dominant displays, or like, or telegraphing.
Do you know what I mean by? Do you know what I mean by uptalk? If I say uptalk, does that mean anything to you?
No, give me an example.
So in Silicon Valley, people will they will make statements with the inflection of a question.
Right. That's very common. Like men and women.
Now, it wasn't common 20 years ago, but it's common now. Right. So if you want to be dominant, you speak the way I'm speaking. You speak directly, articulately, and to the point.
Yeah.
If you want people to like you and feel less threatened by you, then you can have a little bit of an uptalk, as if you're less confident, or you're a little bit more careful for how you're going to communicate the words you're communicating.
Right.
So you end up being more delicate with people rather than direct. So you sacrifice brevity for delicacy, right? That type of skill set does well in some environments versus others. More dominant people tend to be brief. If you think about the stereotypical response from a managing director at an investment bank, it's like 2 words, period, done, right? It's very terse, right? Terse language is alpha language, but that language doesn't get rewarded at the junior or middle levels of companies because you kind of come off like a prick.
And is it body language too? Or? Yeah.
Slumping shoulders. Most people, you sit in front of a desk long enough, you kind of have slumping shoulders.
Yeah.
If you sit up straight like that, you're more likely to threaten people.
And eye contact.
Yeah. And a lot of it's subconscious, a lot of it's not, but a lot of it is subconscious. And so if somebody subconsciously feels threatened by you, they're going to figure out a way to subvert what you're trying to do, whether it's rumors, whether it's giving you a less favorable performance review, because the human mind is very, excuse me, the human mind is very adept at getting the mind holder, the person, to do the thing that will be more likely to result in his ascent of the human social hierarchy.
Yeah.
And
At
so
the
that's
expense of someone else.
so that's why we have jealousy. That's why jealousy exists. We evolved to be jealous.
Uh-huh.
If it wasn't a survival, if it didn't help us survive, we wouldn't have it. Right? So jealousy, envy, all of these things, they don't just exist for a small percentage of people. They exist for everybody,
Yeah.
at least at some point. And there's things you can do to elicit those feelings from other people, and being confident can be one of them.
Yeah. That's funny. It's not funny. It's sometimes you notice these things in a workplace, and you couldn't put your finger on it yourself, but to hear somebody else kind of articulate it, it's like, oh, okay, that has a profound explanatory power, big if true.
Yeah.
Wow. All right, so going back to like what you said about monetize your weirdness, or if you're weird, try to breathe some life into that, and maybe you can make a livelihood out of that. Like, first of all, it's comforting to know that if you are perhaps motivated enough to set out on your own, you probably already have perhaps like the germ of the skills to make it on your own. So it's not like the good Lord is giving you an inclination that can never be. Thank God for America, at least, it's easier here to kind of do that. But like, what are some other skills for like setting out on your own? Like they say, clearly being self-employed is a goal. And I think one step above being self-employed is having your own staff, but you got to start something. It has to be profitable for a consistent amount of time. The internet certainly makes that easier than ever. But like how many like influencers or like coaches can the internet bear? Like,
well, a lot. I mean, the whole education system can be turned on its head by people who know how to do things better. I mean, it's like saying, how many businesses can an economy support? Infinite? Like, I don't know.
Okay.
It can support a lot. And so the thing is, the world is constantly changing. And when the world's constantly changing, new technologies are constantly emerging, which are constantly, let's say, making certain solutions or certain organizations obsolete. What people don't realize about incumbent companies is they all have dated infrastructure. So if that company's been around for 100 years, it's probably doing some things well because it's been around for 100 years, but its architecture's old, its pipes are old.
Yeah.
So newer, the more recently the organization has been created, the more likely it's going to leverage modern tools, the more likely it's going to be in a position to succeed in the modern world. And that's true 20 years from now. If you start a company today, newcomers in 20 years are going to have more modern architecture than your company is.
Yep.
So, the world isn't static. As technology changes, as society changes, things that were once popular become unpopular, things that become unpopular or unthinkable become possible.
Right.
So there's always opportunities and possibilities emerging.
Any advice to somebody to identify and seize an opportunity that like most people couldn't even put their finger on because it's so ephemeral, or it hasn't come into being yet? Like,
I don't know. I mean, for me, a general level of curiosity. You can't teach people to be curious, unfortunately. I haven't figured out how. I'm very curious. Why, whenever I learn something that contradicts something else I learned previously, it like pains me. It's like a multi-month process. Like, why is that? How can this be true if that's true? And then I just play these like mental construction games of, okay, some assumption that I'm making is wrong. And then I reevaluate, and I reconnect the dots. I question my initial assumptions, and then I try to create a horizontally, let's say, durable enough explanation to account for both the thing that I initially assumed and the thing that's contradicting it that I now observe. That's how I have all my interesting observations. Is when I get cognitive dissonance, I think hard for why do I have cognitive dissonance? And then that leads to a new cognitive framework that better explains the two things that should not be existing simultaneously based on my existing framework.
Yeah. I don't think most people even consciously try to cultivate a cognitive framework.
No, they don't.
No. But that's probably big. Like if you're listening to this,
Oh yeah,
you should be building a worldview that you can understand and perhaps explain.
100%.
Yeah. All right. We've been talking for an hour. Do you have to do you have a hard stop
I
at
can
any
keep
time?
going.
I
Well,
mean,
I'm getting pretty hungry pretty soon, so I might need to cut it off in like 20 minutes. But I'm good.
you could tell us about some of your recipes. I know you sell a recipe book too.
I could if you want to jam on those.
Yeah. Actually, I do want to get into like this idea of bro science, because like you've really done well on Twitter. Like I follow you on Twitter. You're open-handed with giving a lot of advice. There's like this entire ecosystem online of people who have this like, this is how I kind of think of like bro science. It's like the same people who want to get really strong are like turning to the expert class. They're kind of like, all right, well, you're the same guys who wanted to sell us on the food pyramid, so we're not going to listen to you about how to perform better. So we're going to figure it out ourselves. Is that generally what's happening right now?
Broadly, but I think, more realistically, people want easier ways to accomplish their goals. And so, you can still be successful eating around the food pyramid. It's just harder. And nobody wants to allocate that effort. Very few people want to allocate the effort to it. And so when you're seeing people who are openly bucking trends, I don't do that. Look at me, I'm fine. Look at how much progress I've made not doing the thing that everybody says you have to do. Then it's going to catch eyes. Oh, I guess, is that an anomaly? Can I do that? How is he able to do that? And so, the thing that I've done with bro science, I wrote this in my thread that I wrote earlier this morning after crossing 35,000 followers on Twitter. But
congrats.
Thank you. As a competitive athlete, as a baseball player, if you think really hard about how am I able to throw this baseball across the infield, you can't do it. It only works when you trust yourself and you stop logically thinking about it. And because that was a hard thing for me to do as a baseball player, I tried very hard to learn that skill, to be able to do it.
Yeah.
And with years of effort trying to be able to do it, I developed a mild, maybe hubris, God complex, I don't know, a self-belief that my body knew better than my mind in certain things. And so I just decided one day that my body it's my body. How does it not know what to eat? Right? Like, why am I hungry? I'm not randomly hungry. I'm hungry for a reason. Yeah. And so I had no aspiration, no inclination of ever eating like a salad diet for abs at all. I never thought I'd have abs because I was not willing to go through what I thought, what the misery that I thought I needed to look a certain way. It just wasn't worth it for me. And so I found that I don't actually need to train like a bodybuilder. I don't need to, go force myself through massive caloric deficits. I can still eat delicious food at the quantities that I want if I just eat protein dominant real food and focus on increasing my performance in the gym, right? That's all. Protein dominant real food, make sure I'm getting my conditioning better, treat it like a lift, so measure it, and then make sure I'm getting my lifting better, make sure I'm working on mobility. And it just so happens that if I get all those things in alignment, I don't need to count my calories. I don't need to do all these things that everybody says you need to do. And would I be better if I did? I don't know, maybe, but I'm pretty happy with the results that I've had. It fits with the rest of my lifestyle. I eat what I want all the time, right? And if I ever want to go off of my diet, I do, because I only want to go off it like once a month. Fine, I can eat some junk meal once a month. And it just works. It just works a lot better. Like, a lot of people don't realize, and I get in these arguments all the time around calorie counting. Calorie counting is fake science. Like, you don't know how many calories you're ingesting. They're just numbers on a label, but the FDA permits companies to be off by up to 20% on their labeling, and that's the speed limit. So ask yourself, how often have you sped in the last week? How often do you think companies are off by more than 20% on their labeling? Okay. How many calories do you burn? You also don't know that, right? The only way that they estimate caloric burn is by having, people breathe into a tube and measuring the composition of your breath. And then they get 200 different results. And they say, okay, well, this is generally what's expected by this age and weight and sex, and that's expected for this age, weight and sex. And so if you work with a registered dietitian, they're like, okay, well, you're 35 years old, 170 pounds, 12% body fat. Therefore, your maintenance calories is X. And it's like, they don't know that. That is a model that's built off assumptions. I happen to burn 30% more calories than what my height, weight, sex, and age would suggest. So if I tried to follow a model that was based on calorie counting, I would be working with two components that I couldn't measure accurately, my calories in and my calories out. Guess what? My intuition naturally regulates calories in based on my calories out. So that's just superior for me.
Right. Well, this kind of goes to the point of why we are losing trust in the old institutions. I mean, if they're just built on assumptions, like, and we're finding out that other people are.
I don't think that's why we're losing trust. I mean, institutions can be wrong, right? Like, is there a reason why they came to that conclusion that was so obviously wrong? Maybe. The reason we're losing trust in institutions is because everybody has a phone. So we went from a society with like 3,000 journalists to a society with 300 million journalists. Everybody can photo document anything. And so it makes it very easy to say, well, I know the media said one thing, but here are these videos that are floating around Twitter that are saying exactly the opposite, right? Here's this overview that this dude, this expert that is not shown on the mainstream talks about. He's incredibly cogent, very lucid, makes a lot of good points. Why are none of these excellent points being addressed by the mainstream? You get enough exposure to that, you lose trust in the mainstream, but the mainstream built itself up on not apologizing, right? Because that was how power was kept within institutions for probably forever. You don't admit you're wrong, because when you admit you're wrong, people lose trust in you. So they end up making up lies to cover for their previous mistakes or lies. And then it just compounds to the point where the cases that they're trying to make are falling on deaf ears because people have lost trust in them for years, and they just keep doubling down on the dishonesty that they have always had, failing to realize that the modern technology environment is not hospitable for the dishonesty that organization depended on for a majority of its formative years.
So what takes their place?
Smaller people, peer-to-peer communication. Right? Just like what we're doing. Right. People, and then our wave is going to get corrupted by other. It's like Animal Farm, right? But they're a constant iteration. Okay, can't trust these people. We can trust these people. Now that these people have earned our trust, a portion of them are abusing it. Okay, now we can't trust these people, so we're going to trust these people. It's constantly evolving. We're never going to be able to live in a static state where it's like, okay, great,
we did it.
All the bad guys are gone.
Right.
Chill now. You kill all the bad guys, new bad guys emerge in 5 years.
Yeah, there's no utopia. The progressive view of the world. I mean, we are certainly getting better, but we're never going to root out all problems.
Human nature. Yeah, of course not.
Human nature. Nope. But I guess the skills to cultivate now, especially when things are kind of crumbling and new institutions perhaps formed to take their, or not institutions, but perhaps thought leaders, people who have more integrity than the old guard who is telling us what to do. I guess the skill right now to help you navigate is to identify, well, who is trustworthy, who does have character and integrity.
And the challenging thing is you need to know how to think for yourself. Because most people never actually learn how to think for themselves because the school system doesn't reward it. So most people learn to think by replication, by repeating what they're told. And they learn to listen to other people who are credible, and then they regurgitate what these credible people say. But that's just a really good way to be propagandized. And if you've never really learned how to think, you won't learn how to evaluate new ideas without somebody else telling you if it's true or false. So for all of the people who are listening to the media disparage Joe Rogan, people like us, we're not going to listen.
Right.
That message isn't for us. It's for the people who haven't learned how to think for themselves, which is most people. And as long as they can keep those people asleep, they can keep on keeping on.
Do you have any hope that the number of people who are waking up, becoming more independent thinkers is increasing because of technology?
It is increasing, but it's increasing. But then what we're seeing right now is the dominant players, the elite within society, is in a position where they can't lie the way they always have.
Yeah.
Like that. They don't like people being, powerful people don't like less powerful people being aware of all their tricks. And so they're going to fight very strongly to keep people in the dark, right? So it's like the rise of Joe Rogan coincides with the rise of people trying to cancel Joe Rogan.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, fortunately, he's so financially independent that it's harder to cancel him.
But there's character assassination attempts. He seems like a clean background now, but everybody's got skeletons, perhaps, and maybe he does too. And so, if there's enough incentive to slander somebody or remove him from the public sphere, you can believe that effort will continually be outlaid to do it. Look at what's happening with Dave Portnoy, right? That's not going to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And the next guy who we've never heard of is going to face the same character assassination attempts if his message threatens people who are in a more powerful position than him.
So let's say they go nuclear on Joe Rogan or like somebody like that. They pull out the skeletons in the closet. I think they already did with like the compilation of him saying the N-word, but let's say they find something worse. Does that just mean anybody can be canceled and that's just the way it is?
No, I mean, he's going to still have enough people wanting to listen to him that he can go to he can have his own platform.
Yeah.
Alex Jones has his own platform. So Alex Jones was canceled, but InfoWars still exists.
Right.
You just can't get InfoWars like on Facebook or on Twitter. You have to go to Infowars.com. We could come to a point where internet service providers are blocking IP addresses of people they deem dangerous.
Yeah.
In which case, that would actually necessitate the advancement of crypto, of Web 3.0, where these types of people could still have their content hosted by a decentralized network, so they wouldn't be canceled by Amazon Web Services. If more people are getting their content through these decentralized networks, then they would decrease their reliance on centralized app stores like the Play Store or the App Store for Apple. And there'd be less barriers for people to consume the content that they want to consume. The challenge right now is the user experience just isn't very good for these Web 3.0 experiences. Mm-hmm. But if there's content, illicit content, and the definition of illicit can change, but content that's illicit enough to not be accessible through normal channels, people are going to overcome the challenging user experience to get that. At least a portion of them will. So I could see him going away for a little bit, maybe, but quickly reemerging. And if he can keep a quarter of his audience, he's still going to be able to bring good guests on, still going to be able to have really cool discussions, and he's still going to be heard, but perhaps by fewer people.
What do you think about Getter and all these other alternative social media sites? Are those flashes in the pan, or do they have any longevity to them? Or
it's very hard to start competing tech companies when you're going up against a monopoly. Yeah. So Twitter has a first mover advantage. Maybe they're not first mover in social media, but for the type of service that they provide, you could say that they're first mover. And so all the content's hosted on their platform. So if I go invest in Getter or whatever other platforms, I'm not going to have as wide of an audience to distribute my message to. So it's going to be less profitable for me to invest in developing content native for that platform. So the content's not going to be as good.
Right.
So when people go on there, they're not going to get as cool stuff. The only thing they're going to get is things that they can't get presently through the other channels, which is going to tend to be like probably extremely racist or sexist, yeah. Right? Because that's the stuff that's banned on the other channels. So the first, the most popular content on these new platforms is going to be, it frankly could be like sexist, misogynist, white supremacist content, right? Because that stuff has demand with certain audiences, and it has a house with the free speech platforms. And so, when you go on there, the first movers are going to be dissidents for sure. And there's just not going to be as many of them. They probably don't have as much money. So there's a reason why tech monopolies have the valuations that they have, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's hard to displace them.
Gotcha. All right. Okay. So let's say there's like a young person who's listening, and you could give them advice about how to be more of an independent thinker, more self-sovereign, and be more financially independent in the future. Let's say that they're either in college or they're starting their career. What would you tell them?
Find a good mentor.
Yeah.
Because I will not be able to convey the complexities of corporate and life navigation sufficiently in a 20-minute or 60-minute or 80-minute live stream podcast, compared to finding somebody who's actually been there. And the thing about life is the better you are, the easier it is to attract talent, and talent in the form of mentorship is certainly talent. So the reason I was able to have good mentors when I was younger is because I was a really good athlete. Right now, I didn't become a good athlete so I could get good mentors. I became a good athlete so I could become a good athlete.
Mm-hmm.
But the byproduct of it was I had good mentors who helped connect dots for me that would otherwise not be connected until much later, if ever, in life.
Right. That's awesome. Alex, I think that might be a good place to stop, but this was excellent. I'm very grateful for your time today, and thank you so much for sharing.
You bet. This was fun.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, you have a good one, and everybody listening at home, like and subscribe if you like this channel, and stay tuned for more. All right,
Cool.
Take care, everyone.
See ya.